Jacobo Grinberg, Extraocular Vision. In 1982, the Mexican television company Televisa invited me to participate, as a witness, in a live program that would deal with an unusual type of vision. My presence was required to judge the veracity of the phenomenon as a researcher in the field of neurophysiology and professor at the National University. I agreed, and in the studio, I found about 20 children who were chatting animatedly while preparing for the demonstration. Once it began, their instructor, Professor Altamirano, blindfolded one of the children and placed a series of photographs in front of him. The child touched them with the palms of his hands while describing what he saw. Intrigued, I approached and could confirm that the description perfectly matched the content of the graphic material. Then, other children were subjected to the same process, and in all cases, they were accurate in their descriptions. I could not find any errors or attempts at deception in the procedure. Upon leaving the program, I proposed to Altamirano to use his procedures to help blind children see with their hands. Altamirano accepted, as did the government department in charge of the education of blind children. For several months, we tried to teach extraocular vision to these children, but without success. Once a week, Altamirano would come to the school for the blind, lock himself in with the children, and then leave. I never knew if the failure was due to the sporadic training regimen or the short duration of the entire process. I also could not receive detailed instructions on the technique used because Professor Altamirano kept it secret, logically. Several years later, during a sabbatical year, I decided to dedicate 6 months to teaching children in an elementary school in Cuernavaca, 70 kilometers from Mexico City, whose principal allowed me to test different alternative education techniques. One morning, while resting in the school garden, a girl told me that she had seen a television program showing extraocular experiences and asked me to teach them to her. Although I did not feel capable, since I was unaware of the extraocular vision technique, I remembered some comments from the blind children and decided to try it with the girl. I asked her to relax, focus on her breathing, and try to visualize a light on her forehead. Then I took her hands and asked her to imagine a luminous line interconnecting her fingers with her forehead. I placed her palms on a color photograph after blindfolding her, and the girl described the information in the photograph to me. Other children approached us. In less than an hour, 6 or 7 kids were seeing extraocularly. We were all delighted with the experience, so we continued it for several months, until both the school principal and the parents prohibited us from continuing the experiments because the children were guessing their thoughts, moving objects at a distance, and beginning to challenge their entire worldview. The same experience has been repeated with identical results in another school in the city of Toluca, this time supported by the parents and the institution's directors. What follows is a description of the Cuernavaca experience, written with as many details as possible, and with the purpose that whoever wishes to do so can put it into practice. 19 subjects were studied, 11 girls and 8 boys, aged between 5 and 13 years old. All of them, without exception, enjoyed optimal health conditions and expressed their willingness to participate. None of them had a history of extraocular vision or any experience regarding this type of phenomenon. They belonged to 6 different schools. In all of them, they were considered very restless and especially reluctant to accept rigid rules of discipline and conduct. Otherwise, they were classified as highly intelligent and alert. Although family conditions varied from child to child, no notable differences were observed, except for an appreciable initial skill in 5 girls and 2 boys with an optimal family stability situation. Initial learning. Prior to the initiation of the extraocular vision detection experiments, All the children received training that lasted between 1 and 3 sessions and was repeated in all the test sessions subsequent to the initial ones. In this way, each child was sensitized before and throughout the course of the experiment until they acquired a sufficiently automated skill to not need additional training. The characteristics of the learning are explained below in the same sequence in which it was developed. With the child sitting comfortably with a straight back, the following 3 breathing exercises were performed. A forced expulsion of air through the nostrils for 60 seconds, with eyes closed, followed by a concentration of attention on the forehead for 20 seconds. Alternating breathing through each of the nostrils for 60 seconds, with eyes closed, followed by concentration of attention on the forehead for 20 seconds. C. Forced inhalation and exhalation of air, in a rhythmic and sustained manner, to the limit of each child. Next, and in the same posture, the child practiced meditation based on the following instructions. With your eyes closed, concentrate on your forehead and let your thoughts flow without obstructing or controlling them. Once you achieve the above, concentrate on yourself and ask yourself, "Who am I?" Feeling yourself. Maintain your concentration on yourself for as long as possible. The verbalization of the previous instructions was adapted to the level of understanding of each child. The total time of each meditation varied from child to child, with a minimum of approximately 5 to 6 minutes and a maximum of 10 to 13 minutes. Once the previous point was achieved, the instructor would sit in front of the child and intertwine their hands with the child's, visualizing a line of light that emerged from the child's palms and ended in their brain. The exercise continued until the image of the bright, white and uninterrupted line of light was maintained. On occasions, the tip of a quartz crystal held by the instructor was placed in contact with or close to the child's forehead. It was thus discovered that this procedure improved learning and accelerated the extraocular process. Afterward, the extraocular detection phase began. For this, the child's eyes were blindfolded using a special, completely opaque blindfold adjusted to the eyelids in such a way that retinal vision was totally impossible. The child was offered graphic material consisting of high-quality photographs in bright colors and with diverse content. The trainer placed one or both of the child's hands on the photograph, making dermal contact with its surface, and asked the child to follow their intuition both in terms of the dermal exploration of the photograph and the exploration of the mental content stimulated by it. Then the child was suggested to make a detailed description of all their experiences. Later, verbal feedback was given about the details of the photograph and about the points of correspondence between their description of the figure and its content. Using natural and spontaneous expressions of amazement and pleasure, the instructor reinforced the appropriate correspondences and corrected the inappropriate ones. The feedback process continued until the child showed signs of fatigue or disinterest. In the latter cases, the training was suspended to be continued on another occasion. The child was encouraged to use all kinds of hand movements, thus exploring different possibilities. When the child was able to describe the figures contained in the photographs without errors, they were asked to remove their hands from the surface of the photographs and try to visualize their content without dermal contact. Later, they were taught to perform sweeping movements in the space between their body and the photographs using rapid contractions of their fingers. This procedure accentuated the details and improved the focusing, as well as the limit distance at which the child could still distinguish subtle shapes, such as printed letters. Finally, the child was encouraged to stop using their hands completely and directly see the content without the aid of movements. A large amount of graphic materials was used: color photographs of landscapes, vegetables, fruits and household utensils, conventional books with linguistic content and television programs. as well as other children and environmental objects. The children were also asked to walk around the school garden, classrooms, etc., describing what they saw. Guarantees of veracity. A phenomenon as novel and strange as extraocular vision requires, in order to be both accepted and demonstrated, strict controls about its characteristics. Although I do not claim to have exhausted all the possibilities of studying the phenomenon, I can affirm that I have no doubt about its existence. It will suffice to mention here some of the controls carried out to encourage other researchers to take an interest in this phenomenon and carry out studies on their own. The blindfold used was constantly examined in order to rule out any possibility of an imperceptible accidental breakage that would allow any degree, however minimal, of retinal vision. No deficiency was ever found in the blindfold. The material offered to the child was continually changed, so that no child could predict the material that would be offered to them. Since one of the possible explanations for the phenomenon is that the instructor transmitted the contents using movements, sounds, or any other conscious or unconscious means, special care was taken to intersperse graphic content that the instructor did not know or see during the presentation. In the same way, other children were asked to act as instructors, varying the content of the materials used. In no case could it be demonstrated that the instructor was sending subtle messages. Moreover, since in cases where the material was unknown, the latter was impossible, the transmission factor can be ruled out as an explanation for the phenomenon. When the training reached the phase of direct vision without the use of hands, the children were introduced into a totally dark basement, where they were asked to describe objects. None of the 4 witnesses used in this control could perceive any object. On the other hand, 2 of the trained children seemed to see them without difficulty. This control questions the possibility that the energy medium decoded by the children is of a photonic nature, at least at the thresholds of retinal vision. The previous control raises the question of extraocular sensitivity compared to retinal sensitivity. Although no strict threshold measurements were made, a test of reading ability distance was conducted that proved to be enlightening. One of the children was instructed to read printed material of different sizes and at different distances. With letters 1 millimeter in size, the child began to show difficulties in extraocular decoding at approximately 70 centimeters distance without the use of manual sweeps. At this limit, it was suggested to use the sweep. By doing so, the child was able to read the material without difficulty and even increase the separation of their body from the printed material by another 30 centimeters. The same child, the instructor, and 3 other children showed retinal reading difficulty at the same distance and with the same letter size as those used in extraocular vision. This shows that the thresholds between both types of vision are similar in terms of size and distance of the decodable elements. A conventional mirror was used to study the possibility of extraocular vision of reflected objects. Printed material was placed at a 45-degree angle to the mirror, and the child was asked to describe it. The child not only described the printed material, but also other objects that the mirror reflected, and that had gone unnoticed by the researcher. The control was conclusive and rules out the possibility that it is a thermal or heat field that is decoded in extraocular vision. A 5 mm thick glass was placed between the graphic material and the child. In all cases, extraocular vision developed without difficulty. On the other hand, when the material was covered with a white sheet of paper or a wooden board, the children saw the sheet or the wood and not the material that these concealed. On one occasion, a child was asked to perform manual sweeping movements over graphic material. A wooden board was placed between the child's hands and body, in such a way that the hands were not obstructed by it but the body was. The child was unable to perceive the graphic material extraocularly, but perfectly described the wooden board. This control demonstrates that the mediators of the extraocular phenomenon are not receptors located in the hands, but that the rest of the body is necessary. Following the logic of the previous control, it was decided to explore the body areas that mediate extraocular vision. In 5 of the children, an opaque screen was placed below their chins during the exercise of extraocular vision. In 4 cases, the image disappeared. In the remaining case, the child continued to correctly perceive the photograph shown to him, but nuanced by the color of the obstructing screen, which was red. Still attempting even greater accuracy in the location of the body area mediating extraocular vision, another more complex procedure was used with one of the most advanced children. The child's body was placed behind a metal plate and their head behind a 6 mm thick glass, which was used as a window for the presentation of color prints. The child was perfectly blindfolded, leaving their forehead, chin, nose, and cheekbones uncovered. Their hands and arms were obstructed by the metal plate. Under these conditions, the child easily described the presented material. Afterward, the child's forehead was completely covered, and the material was presented to them again. No alteration was recorded, nor did it happen when covering their cheekbones and nose. However, when covering their mouth, a frank decrease in detection skill was noted. The child began to manifest difficulties and present errors. When the chin was covered, the child completely stopped perceiving. However, the case is not typical or generalized. Both in the same child and in others, the critical area varied over time, making it impossible to accurately define the existence of an indispensable and specific body area to mediate extraocular vision. An illustrative example of the above was a 6-year-old girl. This extraordinarily alert and active girl learned to see extraocularly in the second training session, and soon demonstrated a special facility for developing this activity. To confirm this circumstance, she was subjected to various tests. First, graphic materials were presented to her by placing them on her back. Not only did she manage to identify the material, but she was even able to read printed words and phrases. Using cotton diving goggles, in such a way that they totally impeded ocular vision, the girl was invited to walk freely in a park in Mexico City, describing everything she could see. At first with caution, but soon totally uninhibited, the girl toured the park describing the trees, benches, other children, dogs, street vendors, and the rest of the elements without difficulty. The most amazing thing about the experience was not only the accuracy and ease of the description, but that it reflected an omnidirectional perception. In other words, the girl described both what was in front of her and what was behind her. Internal vision of the human body. Both the girl mentioned in the previous case and her brother learned to perceive the organs inside the human body. The training was entirely similar to that described, with the exception that the focus of attention was located not on the surface, but in the depths of the body. Both children managed to describe the specific characteristics and the state of alteration in a case of pulmonary emphysema. 3 other children were able to accurately locate and detail their dimensions, bone fractures that occurred in accidents several years ago. The descriptions of the scars on the bones coincided with those offered by the injured. 2 children volunteered to try to alleviate the pain and decrease the ear infection of 2 adults. The children were trained to see inside the body and locate alterations in it. Both were correct in recognizing the left ear as infected in both adults. They said they perceived a strange coloration in that ear and proceeded to transform that coloration until bringing it closer in tint to that of the healthy ear. The adults mentioned experiencing an immediate improvement, which lasted an average of 3 days. One of the adults, the children's father, repeated the operation several times, noting the same result in all of them, with a similar duration. All the children decided to learn to use their extraocular ability to perceive body areas affected by pain or tissue alterations. The children managed to describe organs without the help of any anatomy manual. They located altered areas spontaneously, as if these emitted signals easily recognizable and distinguishable by them. In cases of infections, the children learned to destroy the pathogens by emitting large amounts of energy through their fingers. Especially in the younger children, a slight lateral movement of the head was observed, which tilted between 20 and 30 to the right or left side in a plane parallel to that of the object. The impression that emerged from the tilting movement is that the child's body sought a closer interaction between the right or left hemisphere and the material to be decoded. At the beginning of the training, it was found that the child followed the contours of the objects and letters with their fingers at the moment they began the description. This observation was repeated in all the cases studied and constituted evidence about the existence of a bodily wisdom that later managed to be verbalized. Conclusions. Much of the results have already been described in the previous sections. Therefore, in this one, I will try to make an integration of all the results obtained without dwelling on unnecessary procedures and details. The clearest and most basic result that emerges from this study is that it is possible to perceive visually without the need to use the eyes and retinal receptors. The fineness of detail of extraocular vision seems to be similar to that of retinal vision, as well as its fidelity. Extraocular vision seems to be capable of representing an entirely similar visual world to that presented by retinal vision, without the need to use the colossal complexity of the retinal structure, and, presumably, without the participation of the brain structures commonly in charge of decoding the visual world. One of the most striking observations, and one of the first to be evidenced, is that the children who seem to be more in touch with themselves, the most secure and intense in their personal identity, were the ones who most easily acquired extraocular vision. The phenomenon exists, and its development seems to follow a logical sequence repeated in the cases studied. The children who, after their training, are confronted with graphic material to which they do not have visual access, use their hands and fingers to go over this material trying to decode it. In the most skilled cases, one session is enough for the child to begin to see extraocularly. In common cases, 3 sessions. In their first interaction, the hand begins to sweep the page of the paper without a predictable plan or scheme until something happens that makes the contours of the objects detectable. If the photograph contains an orange, the child's hand will follow its contour for a few seconds, but if the child is asked what they feel, they will not be able to describe something congruent from their manual sweeps. If the above is pointed out to them, the child can suddenly realize that there must be a round object, but extraocular vision still does not appear. Soon, the child tires of their movements and decides to stop making them. They remain still with their hand on the paper, concentrating on their sensations and with a tendency to tilt their head. In some cases, after this concentration, the phenomenon appears. In others, the child must receive more detailed feedback, perhaps to rule out images without correspondence and strengthen those congruent with the real material. In one way or another, extraocular vision always appears in a kind of qualitative quantum leap, from an almost total inability to detect to an almost total perfection of decoding. Actually, the entire previous description was intended to draw attention to a remarkable characteristic of the extraocular vision phenomenon, its sudden appearance. Once the above occurred, the child was able to perceive any material presented with amazing accuracy of detail. Generally, the first session in which the phenomenon appeared involved a very large energy expenditure, because the children showed clear signs of fatigue and in some cases complained of intense pain in the eyes. these pains and the corresponding fatigue decreased from the second detection. In the most advanced cases, extraocular vision ceased to imply an excessive energy expenditure, and the child was able to perform detections without much preparation and with total naturalness and mastery. When other children saw the executions of their peers, they expressed the desire to exercise them on their own. When this happened, the process of the phenomenon's appearance seemed to accelerate. With this point, I intend to note that the absence of doubts about the veracity of the phenomenon and confidence in the instructor exerted a beneficial influence. Next, I will describe a series of tests that were carried out to establish to what extent extraocular vision follows the same laws of perspective and gestalt as retinal vision. A child was asked to perform descriptions of their experiences while the visual material moved away from their body, without the child being aware of the maneuver. Without hesitation, the child described a phenomenon of distancing, and not one of size reduction or material change. In other words, the child correctly perceived the maneuver as they would have detected it with their retinal vision. In the same way, in all the cases in which an object was superimposed on the graphic, the children were able to correctly describe the maneuver. When objects in motion were presented to them, also in all cases, the detection and interpretation of them was correct. Practically all the colors of the spectrum were experimented with various shades of them, and an adequate description of these was always observed. Each child manifested a personal style during extraocular vision. One girl, for example, performed rapid sweeps with her fingers in front of the graphic material because it was easier for her, and her description was more exact. Another boy preferred to read words and not see photographs. Another preferred figures to reading material. Word reading was exercised gradually, starting with a detection of isolated letters and generally placing a finger under the letter to be read. It took only a few minutes for the child to begin reading complete words, even in languages unknown to them. Later, the speed in reading became similar to the usual with retinal vision. Two exceptions to this last case were that of a boy and a girl who read extraocularly faster than with retinal vision, and who showed more interest in doing it extraocularly. This interest was taken advantage of so that they could progress in their Spanish reading classes. One of the objectives of this study was to find a visible manifestation of a psychophysiological capacity to motivate the little ones to learn techniques of contact with their true identity. Therefore, always, the need to perform meditations focused on the experience of oneself and on the question, "Who am I?" was emphasized. In this context, I manifest my ignorance about whether other training methods may be more effective than those used in this research. In fact, some children took on the task of training their friends, siblings, and acquaintances, and exercising their skills on their own, with excellent results. An interesting observation focuses on the most appropriate age to facilitate extraocular vision. Obviously, a much larger sample than the one used here would be needed to answer the question. However, some conclusions can be drawn taking into account the unsuccessful attempts I made with young people over the age of 16, and with even older adults. It seems that the phenomenon becomes more difficult after a limit age of around 15 years. Sometimes group meditations were performed in which lights were visualized and contact with oneself was stimulated. Extraocular vision was always facilitated after a meditation of this type. The phenomenon occurs with greater intensity and in a clearer way when both the child and the instructor are calm, concentrated on themselves, at a level where the self loses boundaries. In other words, when there is an authentic contact with a sense of identity that transcends the purely personal. Another interesting observation is that the instructor does not need extraocular vision to be able to teach it. On many occasions, the children were asked about their internal experiences during extraocular vision. Some of them said that what they saw was exactly the same as what they normally perceived with their eyes open. On one occasion, a girl lent herself to watch television blindfolded, perfectly describing what was happening on the screen, as if the device was inside her. Other children described the appearance of a small screen inside their mind, in which the presented figures appeared. No child mentioned that they had to consciously create the extraocular image. Rather, the image emerged by itself, in the same way that our normal visual perceptions occur. The automatization of the extraocular image was clear from the emergence of the phenomenon, and did not seem to be notably facilitated with practice. However, what did happen as the child used their extraocular ability was that a series of phenomena adjacent to the properly extraocular were stimulated. Such phenomena have already been described in part and consisted of a skill that allowed the child to perceive the internal organs of the body through the skin and to detect damaged or diseased body areas, reversing their symptoms. The last result that I would like to highlight refers to the relationship between the extraocular phenomenon and quartz crystals. Suffice it to say here that their facilitating effect was observed in at least 5 infants, 3 girls and 2 boys, and that their discovery was casual. One of the girls in the study lent herself to give a demonstration of her ability with the TV program, so she was shown a British color film with subtitles in Spanish. The girl expressed some difficulty in reading the subtitles at a distance of 5 meters from the screen, although she was able to describe the colors of the scenes and the dramatized action. She mentioned that obstructing lines and dots appeared. Suddenly, the girl asked me for a quartz crystal that I carried with me and that I use in my meditations. When holding the crystal with her right hand, the girl affirmed that the distraction lines and dots had disappeared, and thus she was able to fluently read the subtitles of the film and describe the scenes in great detail. The effect was so clear that from that moment on it was tested with other children. 2 girls assured that the graphic material presented to them, a series of photographs of landscapes, acquired 3-dimensionality when extraocularly perceived, while a quartz crystal was held between their hands. It was, they affirmed, as if with the crystal they were inside the photograph, in the middle of the landscape, and without the crystal outside of it, observing it as a 2-dimensional photograph. Finally, 2 boys and 2 girls were able to increase the maximum distance at which they could read printed material with the help of quartz crystals. Jacobo Grinberg. Remember to like and subscribe, and let the sound of the bell guide you back.